First, I want to say thank you for everyone. We have people in this room from as far away as Australia, about 10 Western states, British Columbia. Many people came a long distance to be here with others who are also awake, aware, and willing to face the resistance of those around them who are reluctant to face the truth. And after 15 years in this battle, non-stop in this trench, about 80 hours a week, every week, I understand that resistance. I truly do, but I can find solace nowhere else but to be fully engaged in this battle. And rest assured, those around you will be forced to wake soon. Before I start, just something to consider, that all of us have biases, preconceptions, programming, ideology in our societies. We know that. And that programming runs very deep. Thus, we can have the kind of data that I'm going to cover in this presentation in a moment that people can't seem to see, recognize, or acknowledge, no matter how much proof they're given. But again, on this issue, unlike any other, this will be exposed. It cannot be hidden much longer. So from the resistance you feel around you from others, know that that denial won't hang on for long. For those in this audience that are new to this issue, I hope that you can look at this data and see that's all we're trying to do is present data and let you make up your own mind. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a long Q&A section, a chance to meet and greet. So with your permission, again, my gratitude to everyone who has come. Let me get through the presentation and we'll answer any unanswered questions at that point in time.
It lays the predicate and the foundation for the development of a weather satellite that will permit man to determine the world's cloud layer and ultimately to control the weather, and he who controls the weather will control the world.
Again, this is President Lyndon Johnson. This is 56 years ago. How much farther have we come since then? And for those who, again, in academia who want to pretend this isn't happening, that's simply the precautions they take to preserve their paychecks and pensions. These programs are 70+ years old. Definition of climate engineering. How many in the audience had not heard of the geoengineering term until recently? New term to some people here. So what we have is typically with definitions, they'll try to give the real definition of what's happening amongst a lot of completely fictitious, impossible definitions like putting space mirrors up, painting all our house roofs white, as if that would matter. So you have to learn to sift the baby from the bathwater, but climate engineering is a very recognized science. If we start geoengineering, there's no going back. That's what we're told. It's called double catastrophe scenario. And in fact, that couldn't be further from the truth. If you have a drug addict who's told the withdrawals are too severe, you need to take more of that drug, is that really good advice? And the same is true for the planet. When you interfere with the planet's life support systems, you get a very horrific result. And rest assured, the science community will try to convince us at some point that we've been committed to an experiment from which there is no return, and to convince us that we should continue on. But in fact, if we don't allow the planet to respond, if we don't allow the hydrological cycle to resume, the ozone layer to rebuild itself, I would argue, mathematically speaking, we have no chance. These are historical films of what can be done with a biplane, a small biplane that carries a very small payload. And that much can be done. How much more can a fully loaded military tanker, KC-10, KC-135, C-17 Globemaster, how much more material can they put in the air? About 500 times more with a single tanker. So consider how long this has been going on, and yet we have academia today telling us that this isn't happening. It's all in our mind, and that's all condensation. Do you think that's condensation? Absolutely not. And that's from a single biplane. This is from the 20s, by the way. Now, The next image coming up, how many have been told that the B-17 bombers of World War II leaving the trails is proof this is just condensation? When you see the next image, you'll see that that is absolutely, provably false. That's a spray dispersion. And when you see, the military-industrial complex was more than willing to sacrifice bombers and bomber pilots to experiment with weather modification before the end of the war. And as you see that plane shutting off, we got this off the military archival footage. You cannot shut off condensation like that. That is not condensation. For all those who tried to convince us that these bombers were emitting condensation, the massive trails, that is absolutely false, and that proves it right there. It's important to know the data to refute those who would try to refute this issue, or whatever their interest, whatever their motive, whatever their fear. The proof is absolutely 100% on our side. Let's go back a little further. 1927, patent. That is what can cause an artificial cloud. It is not condensation. Let's look at the proof from this image. That is not condensation. That is a patented process of sprayed aerosols to create artificial cloud cover going back to 1927. And yet we have the geoengineering community telling us today that we don't have the technology for this. I debated an hour with academia's top gun denier, who represents MIT, Carnegie Science, Cornell, and Caltech. And he didn't fare well in that debate because the data is not on his side. But they would have us believe that we don't have the technology to do this. It was being done 90 years ago. This is a very important book cover. I have an original of this book from 1938. And from Admiral Byrd in the Arctic in 1938. Why did they have their illustrators design the cover in that manner? And they knew exactly what they were planning on doing in 1938. And there are many covert messages woven into many different forms of reports, materials, and so forth. But how telling is that? The grid pattern sky over Antarctica. And that's in fact where they started the climate engineering first. That's why the ozone layer disintegrated over Antarctica first. You can't put a particulate in the atmosphere without destroying ozone, and that's exactly what happened, and that's exactly why it happened there first. But that's a very telling cover. Project Cirrus. When you see certain official sources claiming that the notion of modifying cyclones is just in the experimental stages, the discussion stages, absolute nonsense. This is 1947, 71 years ago, when hurricane suppression was started. And as they became aware that the public would never accept this for obvious reasons, they've tried to mask what is really unfolding. Collier's Magazine, 1952, Weather Made to Order. Initially, those in power did not have full control over all media as they do now. So we saw some reports leaking out, very telling articles. I have original copies of this magazine as well. But there was much more data initially. Weather as a weapon. This is from Popular Science, describing in 1958 that we had then the technology to control the weather and use it as a weapon. And again, for those who hear academia telling us this is all just a proposal, something we might need to do, absolutely false. Operation Popeye, 1968, indisputed weather warfare that caused massive precipitation over Vietnam to make it difficult for the Viet Cong to maneuver. And understand now, in our situation now, those in power control the spigot. They absolutely control the spigot. They decide where it rains, how much it will rain, how toxic that rain will be. Is that not literally control over life itself at that point, as President Johnson emphatically said at the beginning of this presentation?
Another example,
head of the CIA, John Brennan,
often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do. An SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. This process is also relatively inexpensive. The National Research Council estimates that a fully deployed SAI program would cost about $10 billion yearly. As promising as it may be, moving forward on SAI would also raise a number of challenges for our government and for the international community. On the technical side, greenhouse gas emission reductions would still have to accompany SAI to address other climate change effects, such as ocean acidification, because SAI alone would not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations. Others might seize on SAI's benefits and back away from their commitment to carbon dioxide reductions. And as with other breakthrough technologies, global norms and standards are lacking to guide the deployment and implementation of SAI and other geoengineering initiatives.
Does anyone in this room think that our government or any other government regarding their citizens would ask our permission first? Does anybody really think that? And you heard Mr. Brennan say that it would benefit some countries at the expense of others, making those other countries what would be scientifically termed a climate sacrifice zone. And who has the ability to decide who is sacrificed? The country with the military that's bigger than the next 10 militaries combined. But it's not just countries that are being sacrificed. We here in California and the west coast of the US must be at minimum considered a climate sacrifice zone. I would argue there is much more data to indicate we are a target as well. There's more on that coming in that I will follow up with in this presentation. But at minimum, because of the high pressure domes, which I'll explain in a moment, you need to remember what Mr. Brennan said, that some countries would benefit at the expense of other countries. Please remember that as we move forward. This is an excerpt from a nearly 800-page Senate document that I found. We were the first to post it. Those are my highlights. You'll see this all over the internet. It's from our original post. What's important about this highlight, you can review this whole document at geoengineeringwatch.org with some of the most important sections highlighted so that you don't have to go through the whole document. What's important on this? At the bottom, it says international cooperation in the exchange and ideas of weather modification has been extensive. Above that, this cooperation transcends ideological differences and hostilities. What does that mean? It means that right now, today, and going backward, countries that we think are in adversarial position, China, Russia, US, are all colluding and cooperating with the climate engineering insanity, all for their own benefit, all at the expense of their citizens. These programs could not be conducted otherwise because you can't geoengineer over your own country. It affects the entire planet, and they are all colluding and cooperating on this issue, period. There's no question about that. This is from 1978, by the way. We know how far back this colluding and cooperating goes. Through the Cold War, that entire span of time, cooperating. This is a presidential document going back still further, 80-page document I also found. And this describes exactly what I just described in a later document, going back 10 years further still. Collusion, cooperation among governments. These are skies over Shasta County. Now, can anyone possibly rationally convince themselves that this is normal or natural? Or even if you try to convince yourself, as we have academia trying to convince us, that this doesn't affect the weather? How could this not affect the weather? For those who don't know how I became involved with this fight for over 15 years, I have a background in renewable energy. I built an off-grid home with a large solar system, and I began to lose massive amounts of my solar power uptake because of that. 60, 70, 80, 90% of my solar power uptake. And that cannot be from condensation. The laws of physics would dictate this. I knew something was radically wrong. I began to test my precipitation. I did not want to find the metals, heavy metals that are listed in climate engineering patents, because I knew if I did, I knew it would change my life forever. And so it did. And the first test came, 7 parts per billion of aluminum. I found a geohydrologist and asked him what should be in my precipitation, given my Filtered forested location, he said less than 1 ppb, if anything, less than 1 part per billion. I found 7. Over the next 18 months, tests went as high as 3,450 parts per billion, highly toxic rain. What is one to do when you cannot hide anywhere? You face this issue. If you're standing in the freeway, are you better off turning your back to traffic or facing it? That's the example I would give. The sooner we face it, the more chance we have. These are the types of diagrams that were shown to try to mask the obvious climate engineering method of jet dispersed aerosols with space mirrors or remote-controlled ships to make people think this is all some sort of science fiction proposal, like habiting Mars or something. When you have that, the obvious scenario that we can see with our own eyes, that we have official agencies, elected officials like local Congressman Doug LaMalfa, who knows this is going on, whose staff used to call me at home to express their angst that this is going on. And they were told from up the ladder to leave it alone. And that's exactly what they did. So we have a society, a government, so-called elected officials that are literally towing the line for the power structure while we all go down with the ship.
Okay, so what do we do?
So the other thing is horrifying.
Dr. David Keith, the world's most recognized geoengineer from Harvard.
Over our head, and use that to stop the planet warming up in a kind of ugly tech fix.
You can spray something into the atmosphere to change. Okay,
Spray pollution into the atmosphere to stop it warming.
So in the end, pollution saved them all. We owe pollution. We owe acid rain an apology, is what you're saying.
A totally imperfect technical fix.
Okay.
It would have risks. It wouldn't get us out of the long-run need to stop polluting, but it might actually save people and be useful.
Okay, so how, again, I interrupted slightly there. How does it work? How many planes are we talking about here? How do you do this?
So let's say you wanted to stop it warming in 2020. You'd start with a fleet of just 2 or 3 kind of modified business jets.
What kind of, like a G6?
Yeah, like a G650.
Like a G6.
That's it.
A G6.
And you put, say, 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid into the stratosphere every year, and each year you have to put a little more, and this doesn't, in the long run, mean that you can forget about cutting emissions. We will need to rein in
No,
emissions.
we'll get to it eventually,
But it does.
In the meantime, we're shrouding the earth in sulfuric acid.
So people are terrified about talking about this because they're scared that it will prevent us cutting emissions.
Right, and also that it's sulfuric acid. You're bearing the lead. Is there any possible way this could come back to bite us in the ass? Blanketing the earth in sulfuric acid, because I'm all for it. This is the all-chocolate dinner. I still get to have my CO2, and I just need to spray sulfuric acid all over the earth.
Right question, but we put 50 million tons of sulfuric acid in the air now as pollution, and it kills 1 million people a year worldwide.
Okay, and that's good or bad?
It's terrible.
But it'll be better if we put more in.
We're talking about 1% of that, a tiny fraction of that. So we should reduce that sulfuric acid.
So if it
pollution.
kills 1 million people and we're only doing
bad.
1% more, we're just killing 10,000 more people.
You could do math.
Okay.
But that's, so killing people is not the objective here.
Killing people, not the objective. I just wanted to be clear. I just wanted to be clear.
Actually slowing climate change, actually stopping climate change in a way that could help people this generation, people living now, in a way there's no other easy alternative.
Can you just do it for part of the planet?
Pretty much the whole planet.
No, but could you? Could you just say, just make things better for the United States?
Very hard to do. It seems that this is mostly global. But the big fear is that one country will want it one way and one the other, like 2 frat boys arguing over the thermostat. And in many ways, the biggest fear here, well, we have no idea how to actually agree about how to control the planet's thermostat.
So let's say the United States and China say, yeah, let's do it. But Russia and India say, yeah, not do it.
This is the kind of stuff I wake up sweating about. Exactly.
Well, it's your goddamn idea.
No, it actually turns out to be an old idea. This was known since President Johnson. And the scientific community mostly decided not to talk about it for fear that people would then lose the threat of cutting emissions.
Now, what happens to the sulfuric acid after it's sprayed? Does it just stay up there?
No, it rains down.
Okay.
But as I said, It rains down.
Okay.
It's a tiny addition to what we're already doing.
Have you gotten some grief for suggesting this?
Sure. I mean, this is like writing a book that's the case for leprosy. But
Do you have one of those? Is that next? Yeah, it's a great weight loss plan.
But also, many people are happy that people are finally talking about this, because while it is ugly, it does appear that it really could do some good.
Could an individual start this?
In practice, only a country. A big
Okay.
country.
What about a man in like a hollowed out volcano with henchmen who occasionally shakes his fist at the sky and says, "They said I was a fool at Harvard. Who's the fool now?"
I won't
shake your fist and say the fools.
It's the natural worry, but I think in the end, no. This would be done by major countries, but the problem is how countries agree about where to set the thermostat. Who decides? And my biggest reason for writing the book and for talking about it is my view that we won't make good decisions in ignorance.
So we have to have the discussion now, so that when it becomes our last hope, people can say, "Hey, we talked about this. Remember, we said we get to do it."
The worst way to make decisions about this would be if we all agree that we won't talk about it in polite society, we suppress it, which is basically what had been happening, and then in 2030, suddenly in a crisis, we make fast decisions.
Maybe it's happening already. You ever look at those planes up there? They have contrails behind them. Maybe all those planes with the contrails, maybe they're actually spraying chemicals into the atmosphere right now, and Uncle Sam isn't telling us.
Seems extremely unlikely.
The fact that the United States is not telling something to its citizens, that seems extremely likely to me. Read the newspaper. I think they might have your idea already. Dr. Mister, thank you so much. David Keith, A Case for Climate Engineering. We'll be right back.
With Dr. David Keith, you're looking at the face of so many in academia that are paid, funded, manipulated by the military-industrial complex. They have no conscience, no moral compass, no honor. I've had the displeasure of meeting and confronting Dr. Keith. His job is to try to convince you that what you see, you're not really seeing. And think how absurd the equation is when everything they describe, everything, is exactly what we see. The effects are exactly what they tell us to expect and what would happen. A blotting out of the sun. It affects solar, wind, hydro. And yet, they will tell us that this isn't happening. And again, academia, and they're the hardest to reach, I'm sorry to say. I have many friends in academia and in the field. They will confide in me. USDA scientists that I know well, top scientists for California that I know well, that in the field have confided in me, but that's as far as it goes. Because somehow they think their paychecks and pensions will matter on a planet that does not support life. And if you heard Dr. Keith mention that, oh yeah, all that's going to rain down on us. And keep in mind what he just mentioned. The material he mentioned, not aluminum. He did not mention aluminum. Now, with that in mind, this next video will reveal how they have changed courses. In fact, it happened around the time when I confronted Dr. Keith after that confrontation.
The little picture is from a nanofabrication study, which shows you can make very high quality, and do this in just a jet in a very simple way, make high quality aluminum particles just by spraying aluminum vapor out, which oxidizes. So it's certainly in principle possible to do that. There's a big literature that's already looked at that. And you could do that by either building new versions of these aircraft or even re-engineering existing aircraft. So there's some ideas of that. So you go to an engineering firm and you want this done. They don't say this is hard or unusual. They say, okay, yes, we could do it. Aerosol geoengineering looks like it is so cheap that the cost is basically not going to be an issue. That means that implementation decisions will be risk-to-risk decisions. The risk of doing it against the risk of not doing it. And it makes the problem of how we govern it fundamentally harder and different and novel. So I've told you that it's cheap to deliver materials to the stratosphere, and I'm convinced that's true. I don't think that will change. But I think the more we do research, the less easy this will look, the more complicated the environmental effects will look. And that's a good thing, because right now it looks too easy. So I think that if we do more research, we're likely to find out that it's harder and more complicated than we thought, and that the side effects are harder to manage, and that's a healthy outcome that will make it easier to do the management. Of course, the opposite reaction is possible. It's an empirical question, how people will actually react to knowledge about this. Another reaction is to say, if these crazy scientists are so concerned about putting CO2 in the atmosphere, they want to think about these things, then that might actually mean we should be more serious about the risks of CO2 in the atmosphere. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard, it's more like free riding on our grandkids. And by the way, it's not really a moral hazard, it's more like free riding on our grandkids.
Numerous air quality studies, including from CARB, California Air Quality Resource Board, have named submicron-sized particulates as being particularly harmful for human respiration. Through all the discussions today, I have not heard any mention of this fallout, and has this been studied, and also the effects of a highly reactive metal like aluminum on toxifying soils and waters?
The question is, what would be the effects of these materials on human health if they came down into the stratosphere, in particular small particles and aluminum?
So the collaborators of mine working on the aerosol scheme are actually folks from Carnegie Mellon who focused on human health impacts. And while we haven't published it, that was the very first thing we did, was do the order of magnitude calculation in level pencil and paper, but with an expert on human health impacts about whether there could be an issue. And for aluminum or other particles, there are a lot of toxicological things that need to get looked at seriously. But if you're just thinking about the sheer number of particles and the human health impact of small particles, the answer is, well, we haven't published it. That was the first thing we looked at with some of the leading experts who do epidemiological research on human health impacts, and it's not even close to being an issue.
10 million tons of aluminum dumped into the atmosphere would have no human health impact.
So let me be more careful here. We're to separate out the toxicological. So the alumina, we've only begun to research and published nothing. The alumina, we've only begun to research and published nothing. We haven't done anything serious on alumina, and so there could be something terrible that we'll find tomorrow we haven't looked at. We haven't done anything serious on alumina, and so there could be something terrible that we'll find tomorrow we haven't looked at.
Dr. John Holdren has agreed to serve as Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. I look forward to his wise counsel in the years ahead.
My personal opinion is that we have to keep geoengineering on the table. We have to look at it very carefully because we might get desperate enough to want to use it.
There's a lot there. A lot there, isn't there? First, starting with David Keith. From the time I confronted him at an international conference, and I was banned, by the way, from the following conference, been banned ever since. But his initial response to my question, they didn't allow any more questions after me at that conference. That was their testing of the water, and it did not go well. So his initial statement to me, paraphrase, was this: yeah, we looked at it, there's a lot of particles in the atmosphere, a little more won't hurt. When I clarified, those particles are not aluminum nanoparticulates. Have you looked at the toxicological effects? He said, let me be more careful. We haven't examined that. Could terrible things happen? We don't know. What kind of a statement is that from the world's most recognized geoengineer? We know that the military-industrial complex does not care about the consequences of their actions. And also, what was stated in that symposium from Dr. David Keith at an international conference was the goal of putting 10 to 20 million tons of aluminum in the atmosphere. Not, as he later stated on Stephen Colbert several years later, when they knew that the public would not accept 10 to 20 million tons of aluminum in the atmosphere if they ever found out. He had reduced that to 20,000 tons of sulfuric acid. And you noticed on Stephen Colbert that he stated, certainly it all comes down to the surface. What do we think is happening with us? Why do we think our IQs are dropping precipitously, 6 to 9 points in the US alone? Why do we think that every single neurological disease that we would expect to go off the charts when we're exposed to this, inhaling it, by the way, which is exponentially more damaging than ingested aluminum? We are inhaling this. We know from international experts, like Dr. Russell Blaylock, when you inhale these nanoparticulates, it goes straight into the bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barrier. These are bioavailable and bioaccumulative materials. So we have a campaign of disinformation from people like Dr. David Keith, which is the public face of that disinformation. And on that panel, another geoengineer off to the side, Kim Caldera, that represents Stanford. If you go to geoengineeringwatch.org, search geoengineeringwatch.org, Kim Caldera, you can hear Mr. Caldera stating what he did for the US government as a government scientist. His job was to design pathogens to spray into clouds to infect the population below. Do we really think that we're not being experimented on? When we know by 1977, publicly acknowledged 239 biological open-air tests conducted on innocent US populations. 239 by 1977. Our scenario is far more grave than most understand. This is a high bypass turbofan engine. This is a very important animation for you to understand, so that when people tell you this is just condensation, you can refute that argument. Why would this engine not emit condensation? Primarily, this type of engine, high bypass turbofan jet engine, is on all commercial carriers and all military tankers. And as you see by the arrows, 90% of the air that passes through that engine is not combusted. It's a jet-powered fan. So we have an engine that is by design nearly incapable of producing any condensation except under the rarest, most extreme circumstances. We are not seeing condensation. It's important to remember that even the short, bright trails that seem to dissipate in almost all cases are not condensation. And in addition to spray dispersions, we have fuel additives as well to introduce the particulates. That's what we're seeing here. This is retrofit nozzles mounted on the pylons of commercial carriers. Now, why would you retrofit a nozzle mounted on the part of the engine bracket aimed right into the engine exhaust stream? To make it look like, quote, condensation. And that's exactly what these nozzles are for. And you will find every imaginable form of explanation or debunking. Oh, that's just fuel drains in the pylon. Really, you're going to drain excess fuel as if that would make us feel any better, right? I mean, if we're breathing fuel, it's interesting. You'll hear the debunking side state it's just a fuel dump. That's going to make me feel better. Jet fuel atomized or aluminum. They're not going to dump excess jet fuel into the exhaust jet stream. This is a retrofit apparatus for sprayed dispersions. So you have payload dispersions from larger aircraft like military tankers, and even commercial aircraft can carry a smaller payload. But the bottom line is you don't need nozzles mounted on the wings aimed at the exhaust jet stream unless you're planning on spraying, as the older patents showed. Aircraft interiors, again, even in commercial aircraft. It's important to know the difference with some of these tank configurations. There are looks like a beer keg inside some aircraft, and those are, when you see a whole cabin full of these beer keg-sized canisters, that's ballast. That is not an aircraft that is doing sprayed dispersions. When you see this, different animal. So we know that we have tankers dispersing, and again, the film footage, the patents, everything backs up what we know to be the case with the sprayed dispersions. Again, bottom line, end of the argument. You cannot shut condensation on or off. The aircraft on the lower end is a C-17. There's 2 aircraft there. One's about to shut off. That's an AWAC, a military aircraft. You can still see his silhouette, right? No, he's right there. That's a silhouette of an aircraft in the trail of another aircraft, the C-17 is spraying. He's not spraying. Now keep watching. This is a really exceptional film capture. There's the silhouette. You can see the other aircraft. That's on top spraying as well, but keep watching right there. He's right there. He'll turn on again in a moment. Oh, we missed that already. There we go. That is not condensation. Absolutely, positively a sprayed dispersion. This is off our coast. This is very important to look at this, because we have local meteorologists like Mr. Mike Kruger. How many know who Mike Kruger is? Local Channel 7. A lot of people. I have Mike Kruger on audio now stating this, and we'll post this soon. He stated, this is almost an exact quote, we'll post the audio, but he said geoengineering is real, but the chemicals are not dangerous. Now, if he's One, why is he denying it publicly and then making that statement? And on what grounds would he say that he knows the chemicals are not dangerous? And when we look off our coast and we see that, that can't not affect our hydrological cycle. It is affecting our hydrological cycle. In fact, as I stated earlier, they control the flow of precipitation. They can shut it on or off whenever they choose, and there's various reasons, agendas, some we know, some we don't know. But the fact that that's happening is real, and what you see in these upper images, standard infrared, enhanced infrared. If you looked at an enhanced, which is an unfiltered image, people would start to question, would they not? But they don't show us those images. They show us what amounts to a filtered image. And why would meteorologists like Mike Kruger not acknowledge this? Because his paycheck and his pension depends on that. And Mike Kruger on an on-air show recently accused me of saying that the government is writing him checks. I never said that. And this is the kind of spinning of statements that happens with those who are part of the denial system. What I said was, his paycheck and pension depends on him not acknowledging this, and that's a fact. So even though his paycheck and pension comes from KRCR, the fact that he is not acknowledging this, and his paycheck and pension depends on him not acknowledging this, is beyond question. We are suing the U.S. Department of Commerce. We have a legal team. We're suing in Canada. And we had to sue the U.S. Department of Commerce because NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, was not releasing our FOIAs, our Freedom of Information Act requests. So we sued, and we're getting some of those requests now. And back to Mike Kruger. What we know from what we have received now is that the forecast, which amounts to the scheduled weather, is being fed down from the top. Who's at the top? Not the National Weather Service and NOAA, Raytheon. Private defense contractor Raytheon does all the modeling for National Weather Service and NOAA, and so the scheduled weather report goes all the way down to the bottom to Mike Kruger, and our FOIA documents from NOAA make clear that they are interested in consistency over accuracy. They do not want local forecasters giving their own forecasts. And that's why meteorologists like Mike Kruger can tell us sometimes a week in advance when a day will be mostly sunny, which generally means not a real cloud in the sky, only sprayed aerosol dispersions. We have lots and lots of data to back up everything I'm stating. So bottom line is, we don't see the real images on our local forecast. Consider this, back to the military-industrial complex. David Key's saying it's cheap, it's easy. Again, why would we think they would ask our permission when we have the top U.S. military brass stating on the record that this is the greatest national security threat of all? The greatest of all, and they're just going to sit back, considering it's a threat to them, and wait for us to give them permission. That's a very naive notion. Other documents, and there are many, many more, many more. So when you hear the conspiracy theory, hoax, standard, programmed, knee-jerk reaction from those who are invested in that denial, understand that they are simply one of two things, and especially when they're an expert. There's only two possibilities. They are either criminally negligent of the very field of study in which they claim to be a credentialed expert, or they are lying. Only one of those two possibilities. If you have the data to refute them, they can be readily refuted. And if you go to on any search engine, if you search geoengineeringwatch.org debate, you will find hour-long commercial-free debates with myself and the academician that represented the science institutions I just mentioned. I debated a professor from Ottawa University, same thing. You can listen to the exchange, decide for yourself.
That the declared policy
Why this
of the United
matters.
States of America should
Take
be
this in, I'll explain in a moment.
Allah's regime in Tehran. The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much.
What does that have to do with climate engineering? Many people might wonder. It has everything to do with climate engineering, which is weather warfare. The crown jewel of the military-industrial complex with which they can topple countries without the citizens of those countries ever even knowing they were at war. This has been the crown jewel by which countries all over the globe have been brought to their knees, destabilized, forced to allow US occupation. And his statement that we will be in Tehran by 2019 is very damning and very telling. Let's take this back even further to 9/11. What would 9/11 have to do with climate engineering? It has everything to do with climate engineering, has everything to do with the toppling of countries. And let's consider this when I get done with the next couple videos. Watch them, remember them, I'll weave these dots together.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you gotta come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision, we're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq, why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They've just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." The truth is about the Middle East is, had there been no oil there, it would be like Africa. Nobody is threatening to intervene in Africa.
Consider everything he just stated. What happened immediately after 9/11, the list of countries that were going to be taken out, destabilized, with puppet governments installed. That was the agenda. That was the plan 1 week after 9/11. Do we really think they just thought this up from the event that was described nearly 2 years before the event happened by think tanks like PNAC, Project for a New American Century, which was Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, and many more. And they described in their doctrine, you can look all this up online, I don't ask anybody to believe me, you can look at the original documents, they described what they needed to carry out their agenda was a, quote, new Pearl Harbor. And that's exactly what 9/11 was. So here you have the NATO Supreme Commander stating he was given the agenda 1 week after 9/11. And now let's consider this. Every one of those countries that he described has undergone a once in 1,000 year drought since this time. Is that a coincidence? Absolutely not. And we have leaders from some of those countries stating so. First, here's Building 7. Is there anybody in the room that has not seen this video? Most everybody's seen it. That's encouraging. Is there anybody who thinks that this could happen to a building because some furniture was burning on the first floor? Does anybody buy that? If that's what happens to a building when some couches and chairs are burning on the first and second story, anytime someone lights up a cigarette in a high-rise, we should run for the exits, because that building may be about to collapse. And we have the owner of the World Trade Centers, Larry Silverstein, stating on film that we decided to pull the building. That's a demolition term. How can you pull the building unless it's been wired for explosives? And back to the 9/11 DVD that I hope most or all of you got. I don't know how many I had in here. But that is 3,000 architects and engineers from all over the globe, 3,000 plus, with indisputable proof that the official story on 9/11 is absolutely impossible. Demolitions were found in the testing from the wreckage. 9/11 was in fact the new Pearl Harbor. Weather warfare, i.e. geoengineering, was the tool by which some of that agenda was carried out after 9/11. Iranian general, Israel stealing clouds, rain and snow. Air Force equipment is launched from Israel. They have sophisticated militaries. They know where aircraft are coming from. Israel and the US are joined at the hip. And this is simply the fact of the matter. It's not a prejudice or a bias against any particular country, but it's simply saying we need to look at who's doing what. And the bottom line is countries like Iran, and I know they have issues there. I'm not siding with their government or any other. But I'm saying, do we, Israel or any other country, have the right to shut the precipitation off for a country with many innocent civilians in those countries? Do we have that right? We do not. This is going back still further. We had former leaders of Iran stating the same thing. This has been going on for a very, very long time. Destabilization of countries by shutting off their precipitation. Unregulated solar geoengineering could spark droughts and hurricanes. Study says, and anybody listens to my weekly broadcast, you know I rail on this a lot. Could, may, might. There's no could, may, might. You saw in the previous documentary, Owning the Weather, that this is not seeding to create precipitation. It in fact reduces precipitation. When you introduce too many particulates into the atmosphere, whether it's from the back of a jet aircraft or a volcano, you have too many condensation nuclei, too many small particles that don't allow the droplets to combine and fall as rain, so it's very, very easy for the geoengineers to shut off precipitation. And how many have lived here for any length of time now see when a storm's coming, often the rain comes late, comes less. We have days of featureless skies, dry as a bone. That's because there's a canopy of aerosols that don't allow convection, and it migrates that moisture right across us to wherever they want it to be. That's HAARP. Most here have heard of HAARP, I would assume. Now, for those that haven't, HAARP is only one installation of perhaps 100 that are on that scale around the globe. There are many other forms of radio frequency transmission I'll get into in a moment. But HAARP is an ionosphere heater, a massively powerful radio frequency microwave transmitter that causes an electrical chain reaction in the ionosphere and can heat the ionosphere up to 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Why would they want this? And this is stated military data. I'm not hypothesizing. This is not conjecture. As you heat the ionosphere, you cause it to expand up and down. And what that means is with this directional transmitter, which means they can bounce it off the atmosphere to different locations around the planet, you can create high-pressure domes. Why would they want to create a high-pressure dome? Because in the northern hemisphere, that creates a clockwise spin, just like the pulley. Picture a fan belt on a car. You've all seen that. The belt winds counterclockwise around one, clockwise around another. Most have seen that. That allows them to steer the upper level winds into nearly any configuration they wish. So the areas that are under that high pressure dome fry. They fry. And that's exactly what has happened. This is radio frequency transmissions and how they interact with precipitation. What happens with the radio frequency transmissions is that because you have an ionized atmosphere, it's electrically conductive. And those transmissions can cause the particles to scatter out in every direction, thus making the widest, most expansive, generally rainless cloud cover. And that's what solar radiation management is. The attempt to block out as much sun as possible. Is this mitigating global warming? No. No. They can create temporary and toxic cool downs at the cost of a worsened overall warming. That's very important to understand. Many are caught in this dichotomous thinking that either there's no global warming or climate engineering is causing all of it. Neither is true. Every form of human activity that alters the energy balance of the planet is a form of geoengineering. The intentional intervention is the most destructive of all. That's some indication of the national network of ionosphere heaters, of ground-based transmissions.
The animation you are looking at is a radio frequency microwave transmission.
This is Hurricane
near
Florence
Raleigh, Durham,
coming
North
ashore.
Carolina. The facility is fully energizing and effectively repelling the inland advance of Hurricane Florence. As the rotating vortex of Hurricane Florence encounters the transmissions, portions of the storm's northwestern bands of precipitation are actually diminished, dispersed, and repelled. The rotating cyclone is thus effectively held in place by the transmission facility shown and other transmission facilities surrounding the Raleigh-Durham site. Radio frequency microwave transmissions are a core component of the ongoing climate engineering operations. When the larger continental U.S. map of primary radio frequency microwave transmitters is shown, the true scale of the ongoing climate engineering weather warfare operations begins to take shape. The global network is far larger still, which includes ionosphere heater facilities like HAARP. The orchestrated operation and energizing of various transmitter locations at various times and intervals can and does effectively steer Hurricane Florence along the basic trajectory that was predicted, or more accurately scheduled, nearly a week in advance of Hurricane Florence's arrival to the U.S. East Coast. In 2017, the path and behavior of devastating Hurricane Harvey was manipulated with the radio frequency microwave transmission facilities in the southern region of the U.S., where Harvey made landfall. Hurricane Maria and Jose were also steered storms during the 2017 hurricane season. Search geoengineeringwatch.org, Hurricane Harvey, or geoengineeringwatch.org, Hurricane Maria, to see the real-time recorded transmission animations that steered those storms. The U.S. government has been involved with hurricane modification for over 70 years. This is not theory, speculation, or conjecture. It is historical fact. Search Project Cirrus 1947. Climate engineering is not just a proposal as government and mainstream media sources would have us believe. Climate engineering, aka weather warfare, is an ongoing lethal reality. Though we cannot know all of the agendas being carried out, the fact that global geoengineering operations are real and ongoing is beyond dispute.
Most know here that they predicted Hurricane Florence would stall on the coast 6 to 7 days ahead of time. How do they know that? When they can't predict hours ahead sometimes, how do they know that? Because they have the ability with the land-based radio frequency transmitters, which are different than HAARP. The ionosphere heaters can bounce off the atmosphere and hit far-off locations, but once it's near landfall, with the ground-based transmitters, which I'll show in a moment, they have the ability to hold that storm back, as I told you, to repel. So as you saw, the transmitters de-energized in the direction that the storm went. That allows it to migrate in the direction they wish it to migrate in. This is another animation. Precipitation interaction. You don't see this on your normal forecast because they don't want you to see this. That would be alarming to some, wouldn't it? You don't need to know much about meteorology to know that something's very wrong with that. So we're looking at filtered maps. Radio frequency effect on aerosolized cloud cover. We're told every imaginable excuse by paid liars at institutions like the Weather Channel, and that's their job. They're paid liars, literally. And if you watch them, they're going to greater and greater and more absurd lengths to try to explain away the completely unnatural as being natural. And I don't know how in good conscience anybody can play the part they are playing, but you have academicians across the board playing that. When you see this, when you put iron shavings on a table and you put a magnet underneath, you'll see they align. And this is exactly the effect you get with radio frequency transmissions. So we have every imaginable excuse coming from the Weather Channel, including that that's gravity waves. It's literally like they think it up as they're moving along. Those are radio frequency transmissions interacting with an ionized sky, electrically conductive, saturated with metallic particles. Atmospheric methane saturation is contributing to noctilucent cloud formations. We're given lots of excuses from academia for this as well. Just like we were for 9/11. In fact, for those that don't know, just to give you an idea how much academia is willing to lie in 9/11, we all know of the 9/11 Commission report, correct? Why was there not a single word in that report about Building 7, which you saw coming down here in 7 seconds, free fall speed? Not a single word from the largest U.S. government science institution of all, NIST. Not a word. Because there was no explanation other than controlled demolitions. This is also a result of climate engineering. methane as well. And we have, from the crater that you see on the lower right, we have methane blowouts. And those are occurring from methane that is thawing and literally exploding into the atmosphere. The flame you see is from a methane blowout. The craters on the lower left, there, that is Siberian tundra. It looks like a battlefield because methane is blowing into the atmosphere. And that methane, it's migrating to the upper atmosphere over a 10-year time horizon. It's 100 to 120 times more potent than CO2. So when we're told that all the methane is coming from cow flatulence, that's not true. And that's designed to polarize people, to divide, to infights, cause infighting. This is the source of methane we must fear. And there's enough methane in the Arctic, if it escapes into the atmosphere, to turn this planet into Venus about 100 times over. And climate engineering, in course of trying to hide that, is actually further fueling the fire. Everybody knows ships have been seeking the Bermuda Triangle for how many decades? We now know what this is. We've known for some time. This is methane released from the seafloor. As the ocean warms, methane deposits on the seafloor thaw, they release, aerates the water like a bottle of champagne. Ships have no buoyancy, they sink. Governments have known this has been going on for decades and decades. But instead of trying to deal with the issue, instead of trying to disclose it to populations, they've chosen to try to cover it up with a mitigation method that they also use for weather warfare, which is exponentially worse than even the disease itself. Stratospheric injections to counter global warming could damage the ozone layer. There we have again, could, may, might. There's no could about it. There's no question about it. It does damage the ozone layer. In fact, what we have now, we had a former NASA tech working directly for Geoengineering.org with equipment we supplied him. We now know we are getting UVC on the surface of the planet, not just UVA and UVB. If the sun feels incredibly hot on you, it's because it is. And this is not being disclosed, absolutely not being disclosed. We're told that 95% of incoming UV radiation should be UVA, 5% UVB, and certainly no UVC. We're told UVC stops 100,000 feet up, and UVC is the last band of UV radiation before X-ray. We all know how harmful that is. We're getting significant UVC in the surface now. It's burning trees. It's killing plankton, it's harming us. This is not being disclosed. Ozone layer not healing. How many remember a few years ago we saw some headlines, ozone layer's getting better, everything's fine. At Geoengineering.org we made clear that is not the truth. Absolutely not the truth. And now we know, we've had acknowledgement because they can't hide it any longer. There's a lot they can't hide much longer. Again, mass methane release. Now this gets into another layer of geoengineering insanity. We have, you see in the chart in the lower left, that's a methane blowout in the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia. You see the level of atmospheric methane going absolutely off the charts. On the lower right, another layer of insanity. Project Lucy and Project Alamo, those are acronyms for another layer of geoengineering. So as human activity, and much of it from geoengineering, is releasing this methane, it's migrating into the atmosphere. Now they're trying to use these microwave frequencies to molecularly degrade by blasting the atmosphere with these frequencies to try to molecularly degrade some of that methane with no known consequence for what that does. This is like the commercial we see, take this new pharmaceutical for whatever ailment, and you hear the list of side effects, you can't imagine who would take that. But there's another long list of drugs for every one of those side effects, and that's the level of insanity we're facing right now. Oceans are becoming toxic, low oxygen dead zones. This is happening all over the globe. It's called a Canfield Ocean. This is an oxygenless, lifeless, dead scenario. And we're not being told that's algae along the ocean in China. We have die-off happening all over the globe. Global pelagic fish populations down 90%. Bluefin tuna populations down 97%. How long do any of us think we're going to be eating fish? And how contaminated is that fish already? But 90% depletion. We are not being told. And although people blame the ocean die-off on Fukushima, Fukushima is a huge problem. There's also some relations to that in the climate engineering ionosphere heaters. It's another subject. But radiation doesn't kill with that speed. Lack of oxygen does. And that's from heating stratified oceans. Fires. How many in this room were affected by fires last year? Really, in many ways, all of us were affected because we're breathing air that is horribly contaminated. And the fires are used to blame all our air particulate ailments on. We now have peer-reviewed study to prove everyone knows the particulates are harmful for our health, but we now know and have peer-reviewed study to prove that those particulates are damaging our cognitive function even more, exponentially more. And we are not being told what's in that particulate matter. State air particulate testing, PM10, 10 microns, or PM2.5 at best. They don't measure for anything smaller. The climate engineering particles are exponentially smaller. They go completely under the radar. Smaller the particle, the more harmful it is. We are not being told what's happening above those fires and what the particulate matter is. And so much of it, climate engineering. Try to conceive of 20 million tons, as Dr. David Key stated, 20 million tons, a goal to spray annually into the atmosphere of aluminum nanoparticulates. Again, HARP. Keep this in mind. That's another shot of HARP. There are many of these around the globe. Different designs of facilities, they do the same thing. Remember we went over the heating of the ionosphere, the upward and downward pressure that makes high pressure dome, much like the ridiculously resilient ridge. That's what the meteorologists have termed the ridiculously resilient high pressure area that is parked over the US West, that has cut off our precipitation for so many years. And that's what it looks like. We have the jet stream. Remember I described the fan belt around a car engine block? And that's what it looks like. So you have a low pressure zone there that spins counterclockwise. Then a high pressure zone that spins clockwise. The majority of the US population is in the eastern half of the country. If the climate engineers can keep the eastern half of the country cooled down, then the majority of the US population is confused and divided as to the true state of the climate, because how can it be warming if it's cool there all the time, or a lot of the time? And so we become at minimum a climate sacrifice zone. That's taken from this summer, fires everywhere, massive high pressure zone, so the moisture goes down into the lower eastern Pacific, up, it goes up around that high pressure zone. It's chemically isonucleated, I'll cover that in a moment, and all that moisture is dropped further east. We all know how much moisture they've been getting, don't we? Our moisture. That's our moisture, and who gave them the right to decide who gets that moisture? And if you listen to the climate engineers, they feel it's not only their right to decide where it rains, where it doesn't, how toxic that rain is, they feel it's their responsibility. Because we're not smart enough to know what's good for us or not good for us. So they make the decision for us. This is extremely telling. October 14th, less than a week ago. Take a look at that round bubble. Is that not telling? That's a high pressure dome parked right over the top of us that ensures nothing can flow in. You would never see this meteorologically 20 years ago, never. And we have a meteorological community that absolutely knows this is going on. They know it. And they will not say so until we peacefully pressure them enough to coax them out of the shadows. And if we can do that, the second we do, there'll be an army of people coming from academia if we give them enough public cover. But that is extremely damning. Circular high pressure dome from an ionosphere heater. UK weather forecasts super-rich heat dome to bake Britain as World Health Organization issues emergency warning. Another heat dome. This summer we had fires. I don't know how many of you know. We have people in the room here from British Columbia. Again, about 10 western states. British Columbia had about 600 fires going this summer, state of emergency, and most people don't know that. And it didn't just happen here in the North American continent. And follow me through with this, because there's a reason the geoengineers have ensured that these wildfires will burn in the northern latitudes. There is a reason, and it is part of their agenda, and it is a direct result of climate engineering. We can back that up. Record-breaking heat hits Norway, Finland, Sweden. When you heat the ionosphere again, you cause compressing air, and that compressing air heats. The laws of physics say it must. So in certain circumstances, climate engineering is actually creating these extreme heat zones. And again, it happened in Europe, and you had states of emergency in those countries as well. I wanted to show this image again. When you have the could, may, might coming from academia, we have been horribly betrayed by academia. And we've been contacted by certain people from major universities that have communicated with us for a time until they were warned to shut up. Because those universities are funded by defense contractors, Monsanto, and others. But so many in academia are being silent right now while the ship goes down. And that's the trend we must break. And that should be extremely alarming. Most of you have probably seen this fire NATO footage. How does that happen? When you have a damaged atmosphere, when you have unprecedented conditions on the ground, you have, at that point, conditions we've never seen before. And this alarmed a lot of people, and so it should. We are in uncharted territory. The amount of convection that's being created by unprecedented conditions on the ground, lack of fuel moisture, aluminum incendiaries on the ground, this is going to increase. This is a pyrocumulus cloud. That is smoke that looks like a thunderhead. That's smoke. This was taken over British Columbia this summer. The extent to which the atmosphere was saturated with particulates, and you might remember from the earlier documentary that we showed before we started this presentation, that those particulates cause a cooling effect. Huge damage on the ground, short-term cooling effect at the expense of a worsened overall warming. Take note of this.
Every single person that I've talked to so far has made the mention that I don't know why it's doing what it's doing. It's burning differently. It's burning more aggressive than it has in years past. And I know we say that every year, but it's unprecedented. It's burning in every direction all at the same time.
That's ahead of CAL FIRE. I know a number of people that are high up in CAL FIRE who know this is going on. They're not at liberty to speak out about it. It's up to us to provide the cover for them to be able to do so, because ultimately even CAL FIRE's funding goes all the way to the top. People ask, who does this? Who's behind this? Who's funding it? Where's the money coming from? The money's coming from central bankers who print whatever they want for whatever they want, because the dollar is the global reserve currency. And this was enforced after World War II. And that's why certain countries, another reason in addition to stealing their resources, are being taken out, because they want to disconnect from the dollar. And many of you in here may know that right now we have countries disconnecting from the dollar. They've had enough. They're being brutalized by a military-industrial complex that's completely out of control. And for our military brothers and sisters, and they're the most important ones for us to reach, I realize we have some very good people in the military who signed up with honorable motives. But what does the military do when one of those people realizes it's not what they thought? How many in here know who Pat Tillman was? If you don't know, I would recommend you look up his story. You might remember this part. Pat Tillman was the famous football player that had multi-million-dollar NFL contracts, but he, after 9/11, signed up for the Green Berets. Very intelligent man who saw through the smoke and mirrors. And what did they do to him? They killed him. They first tried to blame it on an enemy ambush, which was not true. They burnt his belongings because they knew he was going to come back to the U.S. and tell the story of exactly what it is over there and what it's about. And they killed him. And I encourage our military brothers and sisters, they have a responsibility to live up to their oath, to defend their countrymen from all threats, foreign and domestic. I was just escorted out of the local recruiting office, which they're normally actually quite friendly to me in there, because I respect their motives. But the motive is not enough. It's not enough to have a good motive. If you're following orders blindly, it's not enough. So for the CAL FIRE people, again, there are some good people within CAL FIRE, certainly, we recognize that. But we have to provide them the cover if we expect them to come out of the shadows. And if we can provide that cover, they'll pour from every corner, I assure you. What is geoengineering, and what is it doing to start and cause fires? How many heard the narrative that the fires are happening because we're not cutting down enough trees? Now that's patently absurd. And I speak from absolute experience. I've done 6 major environmental habitat forest restoration programs that I ran with federal agencies. My father was an arborist. I grew up around trees. I've been falling trees since I was a boy. And I've done many, many controlled burns by myself in years past on a quite large scale, managed them fine. Can't do that anymore. As you saw the CAL FIRE captain stating, conditions are like nothing we've ever seen. So in spite of the fact in the past that I've been able to control a fire that might be 20, 30 acres with forest thinning, you can't do that now. So when we're fed a line that the forests are burning down because we're not cutting enough trees, let's look at an example, Siberia. Areas of Siberia that have been untouched for literally millions of years with no fire issues at all, in the last 10 years have had a 1,000% increase in fires. That has nothing to do with cutting trees. Those areas have never been touched, they've never been managed, and they never burned. And now they're burning. We've had years recently where Siberia lost 100 million acres. How many knew that? The Car Fire was 230,000 acres. Can you conceive of 100 million acres? And for every bit of forest that burns, our chances are diminished. And the single core causal factor is the most significant core causal factor is climate engineering. Because on a warming planet, we would have more rain, not less. We have less rain now because of climate engineering and completely disrupting the hydrological cycle, causing record droughts and deluges, destroying the ozone layer, which is allowing lethal levels of UV radiation to reach the surface of the planet, including UVC radiation, which I mentioned, completely contaminating the biosphere from the clouds to the ground. Highly toxic metal polymers and chemicals. Peer-reviewed study proves that some of these elements, like aluminum and barium, have very negative effects on root systems, causing trees and crops to reduce their nutrient uptake, contributing to extreme global tree foliage and crop die-off as a result of factors already cited, creating exponentially more dry lightning. That's important. When you have an electrically conductive atmosphere, all these particles bumping up against each other, much more static charge, much more dry lightning. I just described that. Finally, greatly contributing to fire intensity and volatility due to the fallout. Aluminum particulates, heavy metal particulates are incendiaries. They're flammable and they're coating everything. From every direction, climate engineering is clearly the single greatest core causal factor for the burn downs, not a lack of cutting trees. This is interesting. This is a flight path taken just before the Car Fire. We don't claim to know with certainty what this is about. Because it's not a tanker. It was not. We know which aircraft it was. The ultimate ownership traced back to J.P. Morgan. Why would they fly that pattern on the July 21st and 20th and 21st, only, I believe, 2 days before the Car Fire started? So we find this very anomalous. We're continuing to track other fires, other situations, whether this was some sort of survey scenario, we don't know, but we find this very anomalous and puzzling. This is important, again, in regard to the fires. The underestimated cooling effect on the planet from historic fires. And we have academicians that clearly don't care about the consequences of what they do. We all know that, right? You don't detonate 2,000 plus nuclear bombs on the planet with no regard for the consequences unless you're mentally unsound. And we have, unfortunately, that kind of mentality running the planet. Temperate zone forest fires can cool the planet. Scientific American. This is a fact. The fires temporarily cool, and the climate engineers, at our expense, are utilizing this factor. Volcanic winter, you heard about this discussed in the other documentary, correct? And those in the science community, again, back to the particulate loading of the atmosphere, temporary cooling effect, and they are so desperate that they have ensured these fires will burn unimaginably hot and that they could utilize them whenever they needed that. We don't claim to know the individual circumstances of each ignition of each fire. We don't claim to know that, but the conditions that were established for those fires to burn so intensely are absolutely a result of climate engineering. These are so-called predictions, so that it's a way of conditioning the population into accepting horrific environments like the hellish summer we had here. Oh, they predicted this, so it must be normal. They're not predicting anything. This is the scheduled weather. This is the agenda. This is the plan. So when they can control the high-pressure dome over us and keep it there as long as they want, shut off our precipitation as long as they want, then they can issue this prediction which programs the population into accepting it when they're the ones pulling the strings. Smoke from western wildfires reaches Atlantic Ocean. The extent of smoke this summer surpassed all other previous circumstances. And that was, in fact, part of the agenda. Wildfires cause cooling in Arctic. That's key. The reason I show all these images is to show you that at geoengineeringwatch.org we don't base our conclusions on hypothesis or conjecture. We base it on science study. This is indisputable fact. When you block the sun, as you saw from the previous documentary from Discovery Channel, you cool the planet temporarily, but very temporarily. When you blacken massive areas of the planet, when you eliminate the boreal forest, you are completely throwing the planet out of equilibrium. It may be difficult to see the smoke on the screen, but the bottom line is we monitored. Smoke was saturating the Arctic very early on. This is before the car fire. It was already happening. And they can direct the upper level wind currents. They can push these particulates where they want them. The Coriolis effects help, the spinning of the planet, which is the Coriolis effects, helps to spin this toward the poles. Another study, another science study, relative impact of boreal smoke in the Arctic, cooling the Arctic. Now, this is particularly important. It's an excerpt from a science study. If you look at the bottom, right there, this talks about the cooling overall. The presence of boreal smoke in the Arctic atmosphere clearly perturbs the surface atmospheric radiation budget. It blocks some of the sun, indicate a significant cooling effect at the surface, even for very modest loading. A passing smoke plume would cool the Arctic tundra. Remember the methane pictures I showed you? With the methane thawing and exploding into the atmosphere. The geoengineers are willing to ensure that we have no chance in order to hide what's happening for as long as possible, not out of benevolence. It's out of an effort to preserve their power and control till the last possible moment. That's what that study is stating. That's extremely damning. Do they have the right to preserve their power and control by sacrificing how many lives, how much landscape, and thus ensuring the course of omnicide that we're currently on? 2008 siege, single largest wildfire event in 1.2 million acres. Most of you remember the fires of 2008, correct? What do we see then? We saw massive statewide aerosol spraying. NASA had their DC-8 mobile test lab in the air at that time. It appeared to be a beta test. Why would they do this in 2008? This is from 2007. Arctic sea ice at record low. The sea ice was crashing in 2007. So in 2008, we saw what appeared to be a beta test starting fires all over the western portion of North America, especially California, and the ice miraculously, the extent leveled off, so much so that the polar scientists were perplexed at how that melt-off rate could have been stabilized. And again, it's a temporary stabilization at the cost of a much worsened overall warming. This indicates the amount of particulates that are put into the atmosphere from a single fire. Look at the bottom. Emissions over several days from a single wildfire, 46,000 tons of particulates from a single fire. The amount of particulates put in the air from wildfires is immense. And this is, again, directly connected to what the climate engineers are trying to do in the Arctic. It has nothing to do with us being told that our forests are burning because we're not cutting down enough trees. That narrative is unimaginably false. A betrayal from our government to be told that big of a lie. Smoke. You see the expanse of the smoke covered. It's unimaginable. And you see how far it extends into the Arctic. A tremendous distance. Here you can see on the top, right there, all wildfire smoke, much of it from British Columbia, extending clear into the Arctic. This is what we see on satellite imagery. When people ask, and they do all the time, well, how do you know it's melting in the Arctic? Why should we believe official agencies? We don't believe them. We absolutely don't believe them. We look for ourselves. And we don't just have this. I'll show more footage further on in this presentation that will show you firsthand what's happening in the Arctic. This is all we see in both polar regions. Why is this so dangerous? Because when we have an ice-free Arctic, which we almost had this year, and we will likely have by the end of next year, what happens? The ice reflects 90% of the sun's incoming thermal radiation. The dark ocean absorbs 90%. When that ocean begins to heat at exponential rate, the methane on the seafloor expels into the atmosphere. And we have Venus syndrome, and that's not a metaphor. And geoengineering, by disrupting the hydrological cycle, is derailing the planet's ability to try to respond to what's occurring by producing more rain. Rain that's not toxic, rain that would stimulate the forests instead of killing them. Arctic's strongest ice breaks up for the first time. What they're calling sea ice right now is slush on the surface from chemical ice nucleation. The old ice is gone. We are very close to what's called the blue ocean event in the Arctic that hasn't happened for millions of years. The ramifications are immense. Fires burning all over the globe. And we don't hear about this. We only hear about what's happening locally, and that's by design. Watch this animation. We'll show you how the smoke built up over the summer, over our area. As we head into July, you'll see unimaginably extensive smoke, and where did it go? Much of it heads toward the Arctic. That's a tremendous amount of aerosols in the atmosphere, and they could not accomplish this without the fires. They don't have enough aircraft, so they're using whatever means they have at their disposal. Boreal forests, our forests, are one of their tools. This is important as well. These are the results of chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. So many people think geoengineering is just these trails that are blocking the sun, that's it. They're just particulates. But for certain applications, there's a process, it's a patented process. I'll show you the patent in a moment. It's called chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. What does that mean? It means they can create winter weather out of what should have been a warmer precipitation, a liquid precipitation event, with endothermic reacting chemicals, chemicals that absorb heat, So what that does is create a cold layer on the ground. Cool air is heavy, it descends to the ground, lowers the thermostats. So as I showed earlier, as they're diverting, they need moisture to do this. As they're diverting moisture up around us, frying us, pushing it back down toward the East Coast, they chemically nucleate it and can create conditions like snow in Kansas. Did you guys all see the headlines about snow in Kansas last week? Record snow, a lot of media hype about that. Did they tell you that it's pushing 80 in Alaska? It's 70 plus degrees in Finland, in the Arctic Circle. Did they tell us that? They didn't tell us that, because they use those headlines to confuse and divide the population in regard to the true state of the climate. While the planet descends into meltdown, those spherical balls you see are a result of chemical ice nucleation that is not a natural phenomenon. We've recorded those types of ice balls in Lake Michigan. I think there's an image of that here in a moment. 75-pound perfectly spherical ice balls all over the shores with water temperatures of pushing 45 degrees. Why aren't our so-called experts questioning this? How absurd can this scenario be? And this is a new phenomenon. If people say they saw it 20 years ago, they may have. because we had this process 20 years ago, but that is absolutely not a natural phenomenon. And what the damage is doing to plains, what cost is that? And what we see now with these moisture events, now, and anybody who watches the weather would have seen this, now we have an ice storm almost all the time in our so-called winter storms. We have, it's happening right now with another tropical system that's being pushed into the US, and we'll have an ice storm transition zone before it turns to frozen precipitation. That's because the chemical nucleation hasn't cooled it down enough yet, so the material hits the ground like on that house before it freezes, before it sets up. This is in Arizona. Unprecedented hail, also from chemical ice nucleation. Stones that size can kill you, quite literally. This is in Russia, the same. "20, 30 years ago, did we see constant hailstones with hail the size of baseballs or softballs? We did not see that. We do now because this is what chemical ice nucleation does. Weather modification method. This is a patent that describes chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. You can find all of this at geoengineeringwatch.org. In fact, you don't even need to go directly to our site. If you search on any search engine, geoengineeringwatch.org, engineering winter, or geoengineeringwatch.org, chemical ice nucleation for weather modification, you can find this data and review it yourself. And we generally highlight the most pertinent aspects of that data. But this patent is for exactly what we see happening. To create the illusion of winter. You can search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm. We have Fox News covering that. Popular Science covered that. Chinese government engineered snowstorms over Beijing twice until they did $1 billion worth of damage. Citizens weren't happy, and they've gone underground since. But if you search Chinese scientists create artificial snowstorm, you'll find US media cover it, but they won't mention it here, will they? Where's this materials coming from? We've identified American elements. It appears this company is in up to their neck with the cabal that runs our government, and this appears to be where much of the materials are coming from. In fact, you can search American elements, weather modification, and find aluminum nanoparticulates, which they manufacture. Freeze-fry scenario. Look closely at that map because that's what you get with climate engineering. One half of the country baking, in this case, the western US, under a massive heat dome in the middle. Every tier is about 4 degrees higher or lower, depending on the color. So you're 25, 30 degrees above normal here, 25, 30 degrees below normal here. Meteorologically speaking, this is unprecedented, it's completely unnatural, it's completely engineered, and then the scenario will flip. East Coast fries, West Coast freezes, because they do not have enough materials or moisture to do all at once. Although, as you'll see in a moment, which country of the whole world has the only anomalous cool zones? The country with the largest military. Who might that be? This is a more recent map. This was sent to us October 4th. It's for the period the 10th through the 14th, and we in fact did see snowstorms in this area while the East Coast fried the freeze-fry scenario. We see Alaska cooking. Alaska's still cooking. The ice is not reforming. We are in uncharted territory. We will likely see more headlines soon on this issue. This is an even more recent map. This is what we just had. This is what I just described earlier. Snow in Oklahoma and Kansas while it's suntan weather in Alaska. Do we see this from our local meteorologists? Do we have Mike Kruger telling us about this? Never. Never. Because people would start to ask questions, and they don't want that. Now, this is what we've just had. This is part of the scenario to create an engineered winter scenario. In spite of the high temperatures in so many locations, you see the completely anomalous jet stream configuration. This is unprecedented. It's laughable. And how we have meteorologists pretending that this is normal is absurd, and they need to be held accountable. You do this peacefully. You send hard data via email. CC as many other citizens in that area as you can so that everybody sees the conversation, so that these so-called experts can't deny that they know what's going on. So here's a tropical cyclone that's going to provide moisture for, there's the direction that took a 180 turn. How do they know it would do that? Why did it do that in such a straight line? You've never seen that, meteorologically speaking. How do they know that so far in advance? Because the storm is being steered. And here's what you got. Winter storm, or tropical storm Sergio, creating winter weather conditions. Remember the maps I just showed you that showed the massive cool down in the central U.S., and that's how they do it. They pump enough moisture into that region, chemically ice nucleated, it cools down the surface, they have the headlines they want. And even in areas where people are baking, like Alaska, it convinces them that everything must be okay because it's snowing in Kansas, even though it's pushing 80 in Alaska. And it tends to confuse and divide the population, and that's what they want. Now, what country do you see the only cool zone on over a 5-year period? This is a NASA GISS departure from normal high temperature map. These oranges, reds indicate above normal. What country, the only country that has a cool zone in it? The country with the largest military, that's bigger than the next 10 militaries combined. That's over a 5-year period right there, August 2013 to August 2018. Consistency, cooling down the same areas, keeping population in those areas confused and divided as the true state of the climate. This is a very recent, again, departure from normal high temperature map. October 17th, a few days ago. Where do we see the cool zone? Right here. So the high pressure dome over us pushes the moisture. Can everybody see that little dot in the back? I hope. It's small, but it pushes the moisture up and around us. They chemically nucleate it, comes down, cools the East Coast, and everybody in the East Coast is confused at the true state of the climate when most of the rest of the world is descending into total meltdown. And look how red the Arctic is. We have Arctic sea temperatures now up to 25 degrees above normal in places. The ramifications from that are grave indeed. This is important. Bacteria alive at 33,000 feet. We don't believe popular science was really in the know when they published this. They weren't really supposed to disclose this. Sometimes the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. What type of bacteria did they find? They found E. coli. E. coli at 33,000 feet. Why would they find E. coli? Because E. coli is used as a biological nucleating agent. It's used for weather modification. It's used for biological ice nucleation, a form of chemical nucleation to create the ice nucleation scenario I've described. Popular science didn't know why they found it at 33,000 feet, and they tried to hypothesize all these insane scenarios that there must have been an updraft over a restaurant that had contaminated whatever. Think how absurd this is. This is academia. This is the experts doing this. This is a test. Biological nucleating agents freezes the water instantly in front of your face. Most don't know that that exists, that technology exists. Think of the first aid kit you have that sits on a shelf for 20 years. You mix the chemicals together, you have ice. That's basically what this is. When you do that on an unimaginably massive scale, you get the scenarios we've just created. And that's important to understand. We have half the anti-geoengineering community not acknowledging what is a major part of the equation, chemical ice nucleation for weather modification. And that's not helping our cause. This has to be considered. So when people want to say or want to claim that these cool downs are proof that the planet's not warming, and none of us like Al Gore. This is not about Mr. Gore. He's a part of the problem. He represents the establishment. He owns stock in the companies he claims to be fighting. But in the case of Mr. Gore's data, is it wrong? Yes, it's wrong. But in the opposite direction of what most want to believe. The scenario we face is in fact exponentially worse than anything Mr. Gore stated. And these processes are being used to freeze sea surfaces. They're being used to create engineered winter events out of what should have been a much warmer storm. This is an example of that. Rain and snow, 59 degrees. and 40 degrees, what happens as they chemically nucleate, the temperatures start to come down. It's like opening the door of a refrigerator. I spend time outside in these events while they're occurring. It literally feels like somebody opened a refrigerator door. So the snow might start falling at 40, 45 degrees. Eventually it gets down to 30, it can get down to the 20s, but that's a very shallow layer of air. We're communicating with pilots, private and commercial, and some of the private pilots that fly Learjets for some very important people have contacted us. Very alarmed, very fearful, because their aircraft, very expensive and high-tech Learjets, were sent into a forced descent from above 40,000 feet because the air outside was 35 to 40 degrees above where it should be. We're into a very alarming realm when you're talking about temperatures that far off. The air was not dense enough to carry the aircraft. And the pilots are absolutely alarmed at what's happening. So just because it's a certain temperature on the surface, that is not an indication of how warm it is higher up. And you'll see the Weather Channel liars. And I'm sorry there's no other term for them. I can't imagine that they do what they do and can look themselves in the mirror, but you'll see them ever more often trying to explain away scenarios why it's much colder down in the valley than it is on top of the mountain. And this is why. The cold air is dense, it settles, they can create the lower temperatures that confuse the population and that layer of air is very shallow. So the Weather Channel is caught doing damage control, trying to cover the tracks of the climate engineers. This is a particularly important event. October 4th, 2013, 100,000 cattle died in South Dakota from a snowstorm on October 4th. Cold, hardy cattle died. A few days later, they're sitting in the mud because the chemical ice nucleation event is very temporary. And that material is unimaginably cold to the touch. I remember the first time I touched this material, 1992. And I grew up in the mountains, I grew up with snow. You could make snowballs with your bare hands. When I touched this material, I knew something was wrong. It was unimaginably cold to the touch. What happens to the cattle? It flash burns them. It's very adhesive material. Giant flakes look like giant cotton balls. It's adhesive. It sticks to their hide, sticks to their fur. If it clogs their nostrils, they die. They won't bleed through their mouth, and it flash burns them. 100,000 cattle dead. Now, the next map is very important. I captured this before it was taken offline. This is during the event that killed those 100,000 cattle. Let's look at the temperatures. So we're to believe that it was so cold, 100,000 cattle died in South Dakota, while it was 85 degrees and raining in Chicago, and while it was 89 degrees in Kansas City, where it just snowed, and it was snowing at 36 degrees, and it killed 100,000 cold hardy cattle that are hardy into sub-zero temperatures. We contacted the ranchers there, and we tried to talk to them about this issue, and they laughed it off. They're not laughing anymore. It's because there's farm subsidies and other issues that, again, everybody's on the payroll. Why are they on the payroll? Because the money's coming from the top. Even back to California, Cal Fire, that money is ultimately coming from the top. Where does California's $50 billion deficit go every year? Where does it go? Does anybody ask that question? Backdoor funds from the central bankers who print money for whatever they want. For those that don't know, you can look this up. The Pentagon can't account for $21 to $30 trillion since the late 90s. Up to $30 trillion. That's more than the whole national deficit. Where did they get that extra money? And what don't we know about? That's what funds black ops operations. But the 100,000 cattle that died was only one example. We had 250,000 alpacas die in South America, same circumstances. They are wreaking havoc on the environment with these programs. That's a lot of jets. People don't realize how much air traffic we have, and that's why it's so beneficial for them to use commercial aircraft. One provides plausible deniability. Well, it can't be a military taker spraying because look, there's a commercial aircraft with a trail also. But again, you saw the nozzles. We know commercial airlines are being subsidized to keep them in the air, and thus it accomplishes many things for the U.S. militaries. We do not believe, we have no evidence to indicate that commercial personnel are involved. There would be no reason for them to be involved, although we know they know. We're communicating with some of them. But the fact that their aircraft are used again, it provides plausible deniability, and it provides many more aircraft in the air to disperse particulates. And we know how many people get sick when they fly now. correct? Lots. It's not just because of it's called aerotoxic syndrome. They're taking in some air from outside as well. And although they're trying to blame it on contamination from the engines, the air intake is in front of the engine. How can the engine, when the air is blowing through that, be the source of contamination? It's coming from the outside. Bees with Alzheimer's, aluminum pollution linked to dementia. Many people know the bees are collapsing, correct? How many have heard or knew that we have peer-reviewed study to prove the bees are dying of symptoms resembling Alzheimer's and dementia because they're packed full of aluminum? Some of you know that. Why aren't we told this? Why don't the beekeepers care? We've tried to tell them, and we need you to help tell them. Look at this study. Bring this to light. And if the bees are dying of Alzheimer's and dementia, what's it doing to us? And we now know it's not just the bees. We published at Geoengineeringwatch.org almost 10 years ago that there was an 80 to 90% collapse in aquatic and terrestrial insect life. In fact, the key source for that data is a former Forest Service scientist, a very honorable man. He's in this audience, and he will answer questions in the Q&A after this. But he was really the source of that data, and he was exactly right. He was exactly right. And now 10 years later, we have headlines like insect apocalypse, 80 to 90% decline. If the insects can't make it, how long are we going to be here? Massive tree die-off. We've lost 3.4 trillion trees. 55% of Earth's tree cover is gone. The other 45% is dying by the day. No trees, no people. Very simple. Earth's worst ever mass extinction of wildlife holds apocalyptic warning about climate change, say scientists. Now, there's no question we are on a course for near-term planetary omnicide. If we don't want to end up where we are heading, we must change course. Species extinction since 1800, straight up. We are losing 200 to 300 of plant, animal, and insect every single day to extinction. For those that claim extinction is normal, it's always happened, that's true. But this rate is 15,000 times greater, 1.5 million more than the background rates. There's nothing normal about that. If you look at world population growth, where does that go? Straight up. Absolutely straight up. So here's the correlation we see in the last 40 years. We've lost 60% of Earth's wildlife populations while the human population has doubled. How long does anybody think that equation can continue? And I'm not advocating for those who have set up this paradigm, those in power, who have ensured we are on a course for omnicide. They are the first ones that should be held responsible for this because many of us feel locked into a system that's doing this. It's up to us to expose them for the paradigm they have set up that has put us on this course. But make no mistake, that course can't be continued. That's simple math. You can't continue with wildlife dying off. And by the way, mathematically speaking, we are on a trajectory right now at wildlife die-off that would put us at 0 hour, no wildlife left, 2026. That's a mathematically certain equation. That is the course we are on right now. How long does it take for all this to get better? Many people think, well, we'll use up all the fossil fuel, then we'll just build solar panels. It doesn't work that way. Renewable energy, and that's part of my background. I have wind, hydro, and solar. But that takes a lot of renewable energy. How much renewable energy does it take, or non-renewable, excuse me, fossil fuels, to build a 450-foot wind tower? A tremendous amount. Renewable energy, although better than fossil fuels, is an energy extender, not a substitute. So we still can't continue on this course. And if we shut everything off right now, based on previous paleo events like the Petam event, 55 million years ago, mass methane extinction. We had 90% aquatic extinction, 70+% terrestrial extinction. About a 10 to 20 million year equilibrium period. You can't just turn it off. If you crash your car through the rails and you're careening through the air to the bottom of the canyon, putting on your brakes is irrelevant at that point. And that is the course we are on. We need to prepare for impact. We could still potentially salvage some of Earth's life support systems, and that's why this battle matters. You can't do that all over the globe. You can't eliminate your habitat and expect to survive. And for many people, they think, what could be wrong? I can still get a Big Mac, Walmart's open. What could be wrong? Food's made at Walmart. No, that's not the case. Or McDonald's. You have to have habitat. and we are destroying our habitat. What does it take to maintain that type of urban sprawl? This is a temporary experiment in self-suicide. And how many experts say that that's sustainable? We can sustain growth. You cannot sustain growth on a finite planet with finite resources. And climate engineering is the greatest form of that insanity of all, to try to mask the problem at the cost of ensuring our common demise. So the bottom line is we absolutely have to change course. And those in power who have set up this paradigm and all the experts that have told us that's sustainable is wrong. And they need to be exposed. And again, if we could expose climate engineering, we would drag so much to the surface with it. Single greatest leap we could take in the right direction to expose and stop climate engineering. This is sea surface nucleation, and this is film footage. This is how we know what's happening at the Arctic is happening. This is incredible footage. Some of those bergs are sticking out 600 feet above the surface. This is an unimaginable amount of ice breaking up. For those that don't know, there's enough ice on Greenland to raise sea levels 21 to 24 feet. There's enough ice in Antarctica to raise sea levels another 197 feet. This is stellar footage. For those who have never seen the film Chasing Ice, non-political, geoengineeringwatch.org is non-political. Watch the film Chasing Ice, and you will see, you can watch it online for, I believe, $3, and then you don't need to believe me. You don't need to believe anybody. You can see with your own eyes the before and after. The cryosphere is imploding. What happens in a pan? You all know if you put a pan on the stove with ice in it, you can turn the heat up as hot as you want. That water will stay cool until that ice is gone. And what happens when the ice is gone? The temperature goes through the roof. Now, on the water itself, if you put a pan on the stove with no water in it, just air, that air heats up very quickly. If you have water in it, it takes exponentially longer. Why? Because that water can hold many more times the thermal energy of the air. How much more? A cubic meter of water can hold 4,000 times more thermal energy than a cubic meter of air. 4,000 times. The ocean has been absorbing the heat. The ocean is done absorbing heat. It's now staying in the atmosphere. And that's a massive problem for us. And climate engineering, again, not mitigating it, not helping us, not benevolent. Climate engineering is further fueling the fire, trapping more heat than it deflects, destroying the ozone layer, being used to fry forests all over the globe, to mask the scenario of planetary climate collapse from the population. No benevolence in climate engineering. This is also sea surface nucleation. That is completely unnatural ice formation. It looks like a chemical spill on the sea surface because it is exactly that. That's why we had headlines last winter of ice in Boston Harbor, and everybody jumps up and down. It must be getting cooler. We hear rumors of coming ice age and so forth without considering, wait, Boston Harbor water was 40 degrees. Seawater doesn't freeze until 28.4 degrees. How do we have slush in Boston Harbor from chemical ice nucleation? It's important to know all the data. That's what's happening in the Arctic. That's the reality of what's actually there. That's the reality. What are they calling sea ice right now? Any area of ocean. Statistically, they are now considering anything with 15% of slush on it or more is ice pack. Isn't that 85% ocean? How do they make statistics like this? It's like when Fukushima went off, I don't know how many of you know, the safe level for radiation went up 10,000%. Did something change with the physiology of the human body? No. No, that's simply a way to hide the problem. It's now safer to have 10,000% more radiation. No problem. Go back to shopping. Same is true with the ice. They are lying about this. They're lying about everything. What do we see with global temperatures? Everywhere we monitor, we see about a 4, 5, 6, sometimes 7, 8, 9 degree underreporting of the temperatures. Underreporting. Nighttime low temperatures going up twice as fast as daytime highs. Why? Because the heat is not escaping. How many have noticed it doesn't cool off much at night? Take notice of that. It's very critical. Again, the greenhouse gases are building up. How many have heard CO2 is great, the more the better, the gas of life? Many have probably heard that. Ask the ocean if that's good for it, what's happening now. Ocean acidification. We now know from peer-reviewed study, from crops that are becoming less nutritious because they cannot adapt that fast to the increased CO2. Peak CO2 absorption from plants happened in 2006. Now the CO2 is no longer a benefit, it's a detriment. We know that. Too much of anything is not good. Water, we need water to survive. We'll only survive a few days without it, correct? What if you're 10 feet under? Not so good anymore. Arctic temperatures, right there. Look at, I hope you can see that red line. It's right there, through the roof. We are in absolutely uncharted territory. Here we have Arctic sea ice extent, straight down. Extent, current extent, off the bottom of the chart overall. Temperatures, straight up. This is completely unnatural. We should be in a cooling scenario now. Based on Earth's elliptical orbit, we would be in a cooling phase. Industrial revolution has completely blown past that. How many have heard that we're in a solar minimum, so we should be cooling? But consider that even major solar minimums like the Maunder minimum was only 0.025% cooling effect, 1/400th, nothing compared to the damage we've done to the planet. We've completely blown past that. This is Hurricane Michael. You saw Hurricane Florence, there's Hurricane Michael. You see how there was no energizing of the transformers here, and that's where the storm migrates to. The transmitters would repel it, they energize behind it and force it off. These are ground-based transmitters called NEXRAD transmitters, absolutely used in weather modification. We all know, we're all alarmed, we should be, about the cell phone towers and their transmissions. We know that they are being used in weather modification. How do we know? We know that many of the transmission towers we see right here in Reading have 10 times the power input that they require for cell phone transmissions. Why do they need so much power? Because they're being used for climate modification as well. And those transmissions are much worse for us, much more powerful than even the cell phone transmissions. Good. Now, watch what happens, and watch which country is the only anomalous cool zone on the planet. Well, we have a little bit off the U.S. East Coast. That's an overall from the 1880 start of the Industrial Revolution. But you see what's happening with the planet as a whole, and it's not good. Humans, this is important. This is important. How many times have you heard how many people say, it's just a cycle. The planet does this. There's nothing natural about what's happening, and it's irrational to come to any other conclusion. And I want to state this, for the environmental groups, the global warming groups, deepest in denial of all, hardest to reach of all on the climate engineering issue. And there is no legitimate discussion about the climate or the state of the climate without first and foremost discussing climate engineering. No legitimate discussion about climate engineering without including chemical ice nucleation. So the bottom line is, when you're told this is some natural cycle, that's the statistical fact, and that figure is conservative. The changes happening now are happening minimally 170 times faster than any previous paleo event. 170 times conservatively. So people die, that's natural, correct? But if you throw someone in front of a bus, they're going to die a little faster, right? And that's the scenario we have. You can't, when you cut down the forest or burn them down to use them for climate engineering, fill the sky with aircraft, particulates, pave the planet, poison the oceans, there's a consequence for that. New York Magazine. U.S. says climate genocide is coming. It's actually worse than that. It's far worse than that. Far worse. And you'll see in the coming weeks and months, there will be more and more headlines as academia is forced to admit the crisis is not coming, it's here. This is important. This is very important. Our legal team did a survey of 1,500 climate scientists. We published the whole list. Easy to say you surveyed that many, show us the list. It's on this post. You can search us on any search engine. From 1,500 scientists surveyed, not one was willing to deny climate engineering on the record. Not one. So semantics are important when you ask this question. This survey is important. You can find it at geoengineeringwatch.org. Not one of 1,500. This is disinformation. It's important you know what's happening so you know when you see disinformation. Sounds dire, doesn't it? To most people, sounds dire. A major climate report describes strong risk of crisis as early as 2040. Are we not in crisis right now? If the oceans are nearly depleted of fish, the oceans are dying all over the globe. Florida, you can't go there without a mask on because the algae blooms are killing everything. Then the cyclone sort of distracted people from that a bit, churned up the ocean a bit. One of the agendas from Cyclone Michael. Churned up the seas, diminished the algae blooms. I don't know how many of you heard, but Florida is in horrific shape, dead marine life everywhere. It's happening all over the globe. Recently there was 50,000 tons of salmon went belly up in Chile. How much is 50,000 tons of salmon? How do you conceive of that? It's happening all over the globe. But when you see this from so-called academia, the so-called experts saying, could be bad in 2040, make no mistake, on the current course, we won't be here in 2040 or 2030. That's how bad it is on the current course. So if you know you're heading into a concrete wall, you figure out a way to miss that wall. And although we can't stay off many of the challenges we face, if we could expose climate engineering and bring it to a halt, we would galvanize the entire planet in a common cause. We could change the flavor of what we face. This is called the Anthropocene era, the age of man. Man has so affected Earth's natural equilibrium in the web of life that this is literally considered an epoch in Earth's history now, one that may be over very soon on the current course, but it's called the Anthropocene. Can't do that. That's Dubai. What they are doing to create that oasis out of desert, they are destroying the environment there. It's done with excess fossil fuels, using fossil fuels to pull water out of the ocean at huge consequence, but that's just an example. How insane does the human race behave? 2,000 plus nuclear tests all over the globe, each of which did horrific damage to the atmosphere, irreparable damage. Each of which, when I hear people say, why would they do this to themselves? These tests contaminated everything and everyone on the entire planet, including those in charge, those at the top of the food chain. Who would engage in this kind of activity? And don't they know the nuclear weapons work after several dozen? Do they need to blow 2,000 plus of them? These are nuclear tests in Nevada. We now know from peer-reviewed study, those tests indirectly contaminated and killed over 450,000 Americans from those tests on our soil. Do we think those in power cared? What about these troops that were told, put on a set of goggles, go out and watch it, you'll be fine? Every one of these soldiers died an early death. And the fallout from this drifted east toward the East Coast, where again, conservatively, 450,000 Americans killed. And they set up, it's like insane kids in a sandbox. They set up battleships or all sorts of structures. It's literally like insane kids with nothing else to do. Blowing up pristine South Sea islands, moving people off of those islands, contaminating those regions of the planet literally forever. Everyone you saw in these films likely died a very early death. These tests alone did immense damage to our atmosphere. Thus, climate engineering, again, heaping one layer of insanity on top of another. And climate engineering used as a means to try to mask the damage done by this and other activities by doing even more damage overall. Is that not the definition of insanity? We are getting some increased press and coverage. This is an article I drafted that was posted for a national health magazine. This is important. We need to reach the non-choir. We need to reach those in military circles especially, to wake them up and to bring them into this battle with us. Geoengineering has left Earth perilously exposed to solar flares. Fukushima, many know we have a triple nuclear meltdown, no end in sight, no technology to fix it. What happens when we damage our atmosphere and we have a Carrington event? That's a massive CME, solar flare. Now we may have Fukushima times 100 or 200, because as that shuts down grids around the globe and nuclear plants can't cool themselves, they will all go into meltdown, and every single day they geoengineer, it makes us more exposed to exactly that scenario. That's an end of days scenario. From every direction, from the forest fires to nuclear meltdowns, climate engineering is a part of the equation. And in fact, let me carry this further. I won't go into the story far. I want you to investigate it yourself. We have institutions like MIT. Most know what MIT is. If you search MIT atmospheric heating Japanese quake, what you'll find is MIT acknowledging extremely anomalous atmospheric heating in the days before the quake occurred. Why would that be? Because these signals, microwave signals, what happens when you put something in your microwave oven too long? It blows up. What happens when you bounce multiple ionosphere heaters off the atmosphere and bounce that signal back down into the strata for multiple days in a seismically sensitive zone? You can trigger seismic activity. I was friends with General Bert Stubblebine, former Army Major General. He's now deceased. What he told me was that the quake was intended. Why would they do that? Why would they try to trigger an earthquake? And by the way, one of the geoengineers I mentioned earlier, who said part of his job for the government, his name is Ken Caldera. You can search him out, find an audio with him stating exactly this. Not only was his job to create pathogens, to see clouds, was to infect the populations, it was also to create geological activity like earthquakes, to create giant waves. Japan was allying with its regional partners before the Fukushima quake. US didn't want that. After the quake, Japan right back in the US hip pocket. And as astounding as it may sound that these types of facilities can create seismic activity, they can. And that fact is scientifically accepted. So the bottom line, from every direction, from events like Fukushima that cause a nuclear meltdown, destroying of the atmosphere that may cause 100 or 200 nuclear meltdowns, those roads lead back to climate engineering. Copy of the gag order. Illegal federal gag order. When people tell you, if this was happening, our weathermen would be lining up to tell us. No, they wouldn't. There's an illegal federal gag order on all National Weather Service and all NOAA employees. Why would you gag the weathermen unless you had something very, very big to hide? Air pollution causes huge reduction in intelligence, study reveals. This is what I told you earlier in this presentation. We now know that it's not only affecting our health, but it's making us much more cognitively dysfunctional. How do you know when you're getting dumber? How do you know that? It gets harder and harder to tell, doesn't it? 5G. 5G is used for crowd control. Why are they so desperate to push 5G through? Because they know they can't hide what's unfolding much longer. And if the population wakes up to what's unfolding, I would argue they'll be taken to the streets with their pitchforks and torches looking for those who are responsible. And if you can establish massive 5G networks, especially in the most populated zones, you literally have a means of neutralizing that population. Quite literally. These frequencies are absolutely lethal. There is no question about that. These are the type of individuals that are at the top of the ladder. And it's important to understand what they have said. They feel they not only have the right to decide who lives or dies, but the responsibility to decide. quote from Henry Kissinger, depopulation should be the highest priority of US foreign policy towards the third world. Do we think that they consider us any less of a liability than third world countries? When you have Americans that are armed to the teeth, if the Americans woke up to what's being done with them, the last potentially counterbalancing force is the US population. And I'm not advocating any kind of violence. Not at all. That's exactly what they want us to do. We don't want to go there. But we need to peacefully refuse to participate. We need our US military members to refuse to participate anymore with what they're doing to their own, to us, to everyone. The whole ship is going down. I saw a very appropriate cartoon with a boat sinking, back half already going underwater, two guys in the front half, two guys in the back half bailing like crazy, the two guys in the front half saying, sure glad our half of the boat isn't sinking. That's more or less what we have, isn't it? That's the kind of men that are running the planet. And this individual who is now deceased. They don't come any worse. They don't come any more evil. What did he say? Major world powers, new and old, face a novel reality. While the lethality of their military might be greater than ever, and it is, we've covered that, their capacity to impose control over the population or politically awakened masses of the world is at a historic low. To put it bluntly, in earlier times it was easier to control 1 million people than to physically kill 1 million people. And right there in red, what does it say? Today it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. Presidential advisor from the days of Johnson, through every administration. Think about that. That's the kind of people that run the situation behind the scenes. And that's what depopulation looks like. Did Iraq, this is Syria. Did Iraq have weapons of mass destruction? We knew they didn't have it. And not many talk about it now, but these populations and all these refugees we see, they're not migrants, they're refugees. And they've been created by much of what our military and our allies have done. And this is, again, this is not to condone any other country or any other military. They have their problems as well. I know that. My wife, who's here tonight, was in the square in Lithuania where the Iron Curtain came down. And in regard to what hope do we have, I would use this for an example. My wife grew up under Soviet occupation. It was horrible. The stories she tells are horrible. So I don't condone any other government. I know what they did to the Lithuanian people. And Lithuanians believed they could never escape that. But in the flash of a moment, everything changed. And she was there in the square where the tanks rolled over people and killed people. And suddenly they were free. Suddenly the curtain came down. If we could bring this issue to light, you would see such a change. You would see a shock wave around the world. It would galvanize populations in a common cause. Unless we want to end up there, we need to use every bit of energy and motivation we have and make every day count. Tools. How do you wake people up? It's much more effective to give them credible, written, printed, visual data. Much more effective than running out in the street, pointing at the sky and ranting and raving. That doesn't help. This is our most successful tool, fact and photo summary booklet. We have about 70 or 80,000 in circulation right now. We try to make them available for our cost of producing and shipping. But if you pass that to someone, you can save a lot of breath. You can give them visual data, pictures worth 1,000 words. What's in that booklet? Images like that. Now, who rationally could deny that there's nothing natural about any of this? This is off the coast of Africa where they were suppressing cyclones. Many might not know we had a 12-year hurricane drought before we were slaughtered with cyclones last year. 12-year, because they were blowing those cyclones apart. But chances are the rest of the world is getting wiped out with cyclones. Well, we had a 12-year drought, and Sandy was not a major hurricane, by the way. Did major damage, it wasn't a major hurricane. But they were manipulating the cyclones. The rest of the countries that are cooperating with the U.S. perhaps weren't happy that the U.S. wasn't getting hit. And now that the powers that be are more and more worried about the U.S. waking up, the more the U.S. is mired in its own personal struggle. Do you think people in the damage zone from Florence or Michael are going to be able to worry about what we're looking at right now? They're worried about their next bite of food. A population that's disabled is unable to understand what the problems are, let alone face them. But those kinds of images help to wake people up. Again, some of the images you've seen in this presentation tonight, very condensed data. This is a climate engineering Manhattan project. That's literally what it is. But if you have condensed data, people can digest it, they can see the images, much more effective at waking others. What the skies look like now, again, data that relates to climate engineering, what it's doing, different forms of climate engineering. High bypass turbofan jet engine, and why it's not capable of producing a condensation trail except under the most extreme circumstances. So when you can answer all these questions in a 20-page boiled down publication, it's very effective at waking others. And you see that, obviously, that's not condensation. You can't, the atmosphere doesn't layer vertically. When you have the so-called experts telling us, oh, it's just a different composition of the atmosphere, the higher you go, the less the humidity is. You're talking about 1 or 2% humidity at that altitude, almost nothing, with an engine that's not capable of producing anyway. Have you seen anybody in a polar region where their breath is condensing? You see them walk a mile and leave a cloud behind them? No, you don't see that, because that's not how the atmosphere behaves. This cannot happen unless it's a spray dispersion that's been shut off. Nozzles, you saw those, tank interiors. Patents, stratospheric Wells box seeding for reduction of global warming. China's weather manipulation brings crippling snowstorm to Beijing from Popular Science magazine, creating winter weather from warm storms. That's what that's about. Again, off our coasts, anyone who says this is not affecting the weather is simply not living in reality. Those are startling images, the unfiltered images we saw before. I'm showing you what's in the tool that we have to help wake others. Again, excerpt from the 800-page Senate document I mentioned. More excerpts from that document. So the magazine you saw tonight, this is another document, Engineering the Climate, a U.S. House of Representatives report. It's a lot of data in a small place. This picture is of interest here. You see that submarine up there? We found that in the Navy archives. Surfaced at the North Pole in the middle of winter in 1959. That's how bad it was then. And with chemical ice nucleation and climate engineering, they were able to mask this for how long? And in their eyes, that's success. If you can mask the problem, even at the cost of killing the host, does a cancer intend to kill the host? No. It intends to proliferate and expand. The host always dies. But that's what we have, and that's the kind of scenario we had even in 1959 that we're not told about. And they were able to, with chemical ice nucleation and climate engineering, mask that problem at the cost of painting us all now into a very, very dark corner. Now this is of interest too. This is all in the book. Atmospheric relative humidity, declining. It cannot decline on a warming planet unless there's a factor we're not being told about, and that's climate engineering. Freeze-fire scenario, you saw a lot of data to indicate the main consequences of climate engineering. We're almost done. Bear with me. I want you to know how powerful this tool is if it's used correctly. Again, the gag order is there. You have copies of radio frequency transmissions, as you saw. These are some of the other transmission mechanisms that can be used over the ocean. What looks like a giant golf ball on a massive surface vessel, it's called SBX radar, sea-based X-band radar. And that's a transmitter that can be utilized over the ocean. That is what's inside of that. Again, you have HARP here, and you have some of the effects of these transmissions shown here. Another study, I told you about the bees. Whales. Scientists discovered jaw-dropping levels of heavy metals found in whales, and guess what? Specifically aluminum. They're breathing it. They're breathing aluminum. We don't hear about any of this. It's ubiquitous in the environment now. It's everywhere. It's absolutely everywhere. The autism risk, we all know how much that's skyrocketed. It's not just vaccinations. It's also the air we breathe. The combination is horrific. And so you understand, we all know there's mercury in vaccinations, correct? We know we're inhaling aluminum. We know we're getting aluminum vaccinations. Every person we've ever tested, hair, blood, urine, full of these metals. Each of these metals highly toxic in and of themselves. When you put those metals together, You get what's called synergistic toxicity. Is it 10, 20, 30% worse? No. No. It's 10,000% worse. It's 100 times worse when you combine those metals. That serves the power structure. A population that's not firing on all neurons, not healthy, can't stand up to much of anything. That's where we're headed. Internationally recognized neurologist, Dr. Russell Blaylock. He's since gone under the radar a bit. Our attorneys have communicated with him. He's a little reluctant to speak out. Frankly, he's worried about his life, not just his life, but his family's. But his statements that are in that booklet from an internationally recognized physician, internationally award-winning physician, telling us the dangers specifically about this issue, because we're inhaling these particles, again, exponentially worse than any source of ingestion. Very bioavailable, very bioaccumulative, builds up in our systems, affecting everything. All in the booklet. And this is important, because people lose hope. They feel, if we can't put it back to where it was, why try? Why try? And I would argue, and an example I've used, if your child was in a burning structure and you knew you had very little chance of saving that child, would you just sit outside and watch it burn? Or would you do anything you could to try if there was any chance at all? And there is a chance. There is absolutely a chance. And no one knows. I want to stress this, no one knows. How many in here know who Guy McPherson is? A few. I know Guy. I was on decent terms with Guy. He's an internationally recognized polar scientist that says, we're done. Get your affairs in order. We have perhaps 2 or 3 years left. Now, Guy's frontline data is unfortunately generally on track, but Guy adamantly denies climate engineering. And I believe he's been warned to deny it, because he allowed me to post an article drafted for his site addressing the issue. He got hammered by academia, and he immediately changed his position. The last time I was with Guy McPherson, he behaved like a raving maniac. He thought he was mic'd. He literally thought he was mic'd. He wanted to meet me twice in the same day, was behaving very erratically, denying this issue. I met with him with 2 other scientists, one in this room, Forest Service scientists, Fish and Game scientists. We taped the conversation, then he wanted us to retract it. So what we have is a scientist that's telling us we only have 2 to 3 years, but he's omitting the single most destructive factor in the equation. And that's criminal for him to do that. Because if we stop this and we allow the planet to respond, no one knows, not Guy McPherson, not me, not anybody else, how profound the planet's life response will be. We don't know. What we do know is that if nature's given any chance at all, nature finds a way. And what this states for those who lose hope, how can we stop the ongoing climate engineering, weather warfare assault? We have instructions on our homepage, and if you look at the saying below that billboard, when the whole world is silent, even one voice becomes powerful. And we have many voices in this room. And if we look at the mathematical equation, as hopeless as it might seem, we only need to tilt the scale in the right direction. That's all. We only need to put a crack in the dam. That's all. We don't need to dismantle the whole dam. If we put a crack in the dam, the power structure can't plug. And this issue comes to light. Again, we will galvanize the planet in a common cause that people all over the world will know what has been done to them without their knowledge or their consent. And any one of us could be that final grain of sand on the scale to tilt the equation. And mathematically speaking, if you told 2 people and passed on data at the beginning of a 30-day month, this is an important example I used before, but it's important to remember this, and you told them to do the same the second day, 2 each, next day, each 2 each, at the end of 30 days, you're into many millions. That's the exponential equation we face, and that's why each of us matters in this room. We are not helpless, and those in power are not gods. How many mistakes do they make? Even in their misadventures in the Middle East, how many mistakes do they make? How big of a trail of debris do they leave behind them? It seems they could have, whatever their agenda, done a little bit better job than they do. If we expose them, their agenda will not reach fruition, period. Back page of the booklet. 2 more slides, and we're done. we have film footage like this to share with others. If you show something like this to someone who claims that's just condensation, you're probably not going to reach that person because they're not ready to wake up yet. Don't pound your head against the same wall. Plant the seed and move on. And know that seed will be forced to sprout soon, very soon. There'll be no denying what's happening. But if you give people the dots they need to form a correct picture, once they're ready to wake up, we have the potential again to change the flavor of what we face and the potential to salvage some part of our planet's life support systems. Now, anyone who could think that that's normal or natural, this has taken over the Eastern Sierras recently. Who could possibly think that's normal? And again, consider academia telling you, no, that's not climate engineering. Climate engineering would look exactly like that. Exactly. Jet spraying particulates to block the sky and grid patterns, like the book I showed at the beginning of this presentation in 1938, showing this was part of the plan. So when so-called academicians tell you you're not really seeing what you think you're seeing, stand your ground. Stand your ground. Why are we here if not to engage in such a battle at this most critical time? If not to fight for the greater good? Because I grew up in the forest and I grieve every day. I can't not do this. 80 hours a week, I can't not do this. I can't look my children in the eyes or myself in the mirror and not do this. And when I walk through the forest, and I do grieve there, literally, and I think of every bat, bird, bee, frog, every creature that has no voice except for us, except for us. And so long as any of them are willing to fight on, we must be willing to fight on as well. Because that's what nature does. Given any chance at all, that's what nature does. And we must allow the planet to respond to what's happening. And just like what happened in Lithuania that I described, when they thought they could never change the situation, in the blink of an eye it changed because they didn't give up. If we don't give up, anything's possible, even now. And this is important to remember. And there's no arguing with this. There's no arguing that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And I would argue that a good man or good woman would not do nothing. It's incumbent upon us to do what we can, to do everything we can, and we owe this to our children. I feel I don't own my life. I owe it to my children. I owe it to the web of life. And I've been given so many, what I call so much bonus time. In the course of working in the forest alone for a number of years and falling trees and jackstraw areas and trying to put that habitat back to where it was, I've taken a lot of chances. And I've had things happen that I can't explain. I don't pretend to know what happened, but all of us have had circumstances happen where we know we made a big mistake. It should have cost us everything, but somehow we're still here. There's a reason we're still here. And I've been given enough of these bonus time scenarios where at a certain point you just can't help but feel it. You owe everything back to the whole, everything. If you can do anything, what greater purpose could there be in being here? And that is where solace exists. It does not exist in trying to hide from the problem. It exists in facing it head on. Clinical psychologists tell us, like Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled, the hallmark of a healthy mind is an unyielding willingness to face the truth, no matter how dire. That's a healthy mind. Not a, let's think happy thoughts and hope everything gets better. That's not a healthy mind. And if you face this problem head on, you will find much more solace than you will ever find by trying to hide from this. And if we collectively face this, even at this late hour, we could yet do profound good. Make your voice heard in the battle to expose and halt climate engineering. I'm very grateful for everybody who came here to hear this presentation. If we can, after a Q&A period, after I have a lozenge or two, so I lose my voice, I will try to quickly and concisely answer as many questions as we can get at. If we, after that, make connections with others, which is one of the reasons we're joined together here, if you can learn how to effectively and efficiently wake others, even with the amount of people that are in this room, we could literally help tilt the scale, especially in this area, because we may file our lawsuit here already. We're working on that. But if we collectively stand and face the gathering storm, we could yet make a difference. Thank you.